Good evening, everybody. My name is Sarah Reddington, and I'm a faculty member in the Child and Youth Study Department, and I will be moderating tonight's panel. So my colleague Jennifer Brady and I, Jennifer's on the end there, are thrilled that you've joined us tonight. So thank you for coming. We are setting up food, so in a moment, feel free to grab food and refreshments. We have a superb panel, as you can see, sitting in front of you, who will speak shortly about their personal experiences and expertise in the area of trans nutrition and health. But before I introduce the panel, there are a couple of facility access mentions and important thank yous. First, you will find a gender-neutral washroom on the 4th floor of this building. We also invite guests to access our Safer Space room, which is located in Rosario 111A at any point tonight. If you go around the corner and follow the left past the pantry there, you'll see the room to 11A. Our Mount Safer Space is a place where our Two-Spirit LGBT community members can be welcomed and affirmed. But first, some important thank yous. First, I'd like to thank our university president and vice chancellor, Dr. Mary Bouchard, for supporting this event. Do you want to come up here for a second, Mary? You can come stand beside me. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Dr. Bouchard has been instrumental in advancing inclusivity on our campus. In particular, she has prioritized assessing our Mount's climate to ensure underrepresented identities are supported and reflected in our communications via campus signage, language, and at faculty, staff, and student events. For example, many of you might have seen our permanent pride steps that lead up to Everestus, or witnessed our Mount's participation in last year's Halifax Pride Parade. So thank you for your ongoing commitment to building an inclusive campus for all.
Thank you.
I really appreciate it. I'd also like to thank our Office of Communications and Public Relations for promoting this event. And a special thank you to Lauren Leal, who's with us tonight. In the middle there, raise your hand, who's worked tirelessly to bring this event together. So thank you, Lauren. For tonight's panel, each panel member will speak for 5 minutes, followed with a Q&A. And we ask that you hold your questions until the end. You will see notepads on the tables to record any questions that you have. I will now read the short biographies given to me by panel participants, as it is important that introductions are in first voice. So from my far right, Dr. Jennifer Brady. Jenna's research spans critical and feminist perspectives on food, nutrition, eating, and bodily discourse. One area of her work explores how traditional heteronormative gender frameworks produce limitations on how a person then experiences social and cultural relationships to food and nutrition. And Jenna will address this topic this evening. Lindsay is a 4th-year nutrition and dietetics student at Acadia and will be attending the University of Toronto's Masters in Public Health and Nutrition and Dietetics program this fall. As Dr. Catherine Morley's research assistant, she studies the eating experiences and nutrition concerns of gender-variant individuals to further the development of best practice guidelines. Charlie is a local musician, music mentor, bartender, axe-throwing coach, and a participant on MasterChef Canada Season 5. Currently, he is raising mental health awareness with his campaign, SOS-NS, and offers free multimedia education as Wolfville's Media Makery Executive Project Director. Daniel has been a student here at the Mount for 5 years, and he has been transitioning for 8. He will be discussing mostly the social aspects. Laura is a parent, writer, and worker living and working in Halifax. She has been living openly for 6 years and currently works for the Loaded Ladle, a food cooperative based out of the Dalhousie Students' Union. Ray is a trans woman and secretary of the board for the Nova Scotia Rainbow Action Project. Maxine is a registered health nurse and manager of health services at the Mount. She works to support Two-Spirit LGBTQ community in personalizing healthcare. She is also a member of the Stay Connected Mental Health Project that supports breaking down systematic barriers to to offer health services in more accessible ways. Please join me in welcoming the panel. So it looks like you're up, Brady. Time to chat.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for the introduction. So there's two main points that I wanted to address, and these points I pull from my background, which spans both nutrition science training as a dietitian, as well as practice in that area, as well as a background in women and gender studies and cultural studies to understand how we understand and act on ideas around what gender and sex are and how they inform our everyday practices such as eating and practice around health and nutrition. So the first point I wanted to make is drawing more so on that nutrition science and dietitian background to address the way that we understand the body and health as biophysical things, as things that we can measure, the things that we address, the way that food and nutrition does have an impact on the physical material body. And so what I would want to draw your attention to there is really the way that gender and sex binaries are fundamentally rooted in how we understand health and nutrition and food. So for example, equations that are regularly used in dietetic practice as well as medical practice, nursing practice, are based on a sex binary. So to estimate people's energy requirements, you use a certain formula for men and a certain formula for women. So that's one example of the way that this binary is really ingrained in the knowledge, the research, and the practice for health professionals, including dietitians. Another example of the way that health and nutrition recommendations are, that binary is fundamentally built into nutrition and health practice is Canada's Food Guide. So the most recent version of Canada's Food Guide that just came out a few weeks ago, thank you, Carly, actually dropped the gender categories for recommendations around the amount of food that someone needs every day. But up until very recently, that was very clear in the food guide that men needed a certain amount of food, women needed a certain amount of food. So that reflects not just the binary, but also ideological understandings about men's bodies and women's bodies being fundamentally different, men fundamentally needing more food than women. The other thing I would just address from a dietetic perspective are particular nutrition concerns for the trans community that I think at this point in time are certainly under-researched and not very well understood in terms of how understanding those things needs to inform health professional practice. So for example, eating disorders and disordered eating practices are made more complex by the process of transitioning, for example. So eating disorders often can reflect experiences of trauma, but also can reflect the desire for shaping the body in certain ways. And I think that that's something that requires more research really to understand, to inform health professional practice. So the second point that I wanted to make, just shifting gears a little bit to understand food and eating, not just as biophysical or material practices, but also as social practices. I think the other thing that is worthy of further research and understanding is the way that food relationships and relationships to nutrition and health also need better understanding and research to understand how that plays out for trans individuals and within trans communities. So although we're not ever told this, is one thing I often ask my students, is about what we understand women and men as eating. So somehow we all understand that there's social norms around what women should eat and men should eat. And of course that's made more complex when we try to redress the binary that shapes those the cultural narrative around what is food and eating and even understandings of health for women and for men. So with that, I will wrap it up and turn it on to Lindsay.
Thank you so much. So, as Jen mentioned, my name is Lindsay, and I'm a fourth-year student at Acadia University. I am Dr. Morley's research assistant. And so Dr. Morley became really interested in transgender nutrition and nutrition counseling for transgender individuals because her eldest child actually transitioned. So as a dietitian, she looked at, okay, well, how does this frame nutrition assessment for people who are transgender? What do we do for these individuals? And the more we looked in the literature, the more we found that there's nothing out there. We don't have any best practice guidelines right now. So that's where I come in. So I've been helping Dr. Morley, and our purpose is to learn more about the eating experiences and nutrition concerns of gender variant and transgender individuals in order to further the creation of best practice guidelines. So what we did, our team, myself, Dr. Morley, and another research assistant, Heather Bonnell, who has done a few talks here at MSVU, we got together and we got a team together with Acadia Pride and some other interested individuals, and we put on what we call a carousel-style community conversation potluck event, which really just means we got a whole bunch of people together from the community, we fed them great food, and then we asked them a whole bunch of questions. So we had 35 individuals come out to our research. 3 of them were transgender, and although this is a really small sample size, a lot of the findings that we had consensus between the individuals, and the quality of the evidence that they gave us was really overwhelming. So we really don't think that it was that much of a limitation to only have the 3. So what we did is we had 19 questions, and we took over the 4th floor of our science building, which is our nutrition building. We made it gender barrier free for the evening. We had signs up on all the washrooms that saying they were gender neutral, and we posted all our questions all around the venue so that people could freely circulate to them, anonymously answer them, but also it would foster conversation around the topic, which ended up happening. So we did create a community conversation, which is exactly what we wanted to do. So in analyzing the findings, I found 4 main themes. And the first theme was that, as Jen was saying, gender variant individuals experience gender stereotypes around eating, but they actually actively use the gender stereotypes in order to fit in with their gender. So they did this in 2 main ways. They used eating to modify their bodies to pass in their new gender, and they also used gender stereotypes around eating to fit in social situations and also stay safe in those social situations. So they would do things such as trying to eat more neatly and adhering to gendered expectations around portion sizes, as well as food choices, making food choices that aligned with their gender, and they reported that this actually improved people's dispositions towards them while they were out in social situations. So that was a big one. The second one we found was that gender variant individuals experience a lot of barriers to accessing food, both at restaurants, at grocery stores, and in their own homes. So we found that the fear of encountering transphobia was a huge barrier to accessing food out in the community. One person actually told a heartbreaking story about how they had recently transitioned, but they kept an old pair of their male clothing so that they could dress as a male to go to the grocery store and get groceries without fear of any violence or encountering transphobia. And so that's extremely damaging for transgender individuals and really showcased the ways in which we as a society put limitations on gender variant individuals to access food and therefore create food insecurity and malnutrition risk among this population. The third main theme were the physiological and hormonal impacts that transitioning had on eating for transgender individuals. So some of the reported hormonal impacts were things like estrogen tended to shrink their appetite, and they experienced lethargy and low blood pressure from some of the medications that they were on. So the lethargy coupled with the lethargy from mental health issues that are more pervasive for transgender individuals really impacted their ability to get food. And then they also, the fourth and final theme was they had suggestions for dietitians, so things such as not misgendering people when you call on them from your waiting room, so not saying Mr. or Mrs., and then having their name right on your intake forms. And also ally flags they found quite empowering. One quote that they made was that ally flags are empowering because they make me feel like my provider is proud of who I am. So all of these findings really spoke to why we believe that dietitians are a crucial part of the healthcare team for gender variant individuals and how we can really make some changes to affect meaningful change in our communities. Thank you.
Great, Charlie?
Hello, my name's Charlie Johnson. I'm going to talk to you about being a singer and transitioning. It was one of my biggest fears, transitioning, other than normal acceptance and all of those sorts of things, but I didn't want to lose my voice. And so right now I'm on the waiting list to take hormones, but in the meantime I've done a lot of research on what is actually going to happen, how can I minimize the range loss, things like that. So when doing that research, I found a lot of other people had the same fear. And so I've been doing music for 20 years. I'm 24, and professionally I've been doing it for 5. And the first thing that I had to do was change my stage name. So I went under my given name, which was Layla Kelly, and obviously I didn't want to get up on stage and be Layla Kelly, so I had to make an official change to a gender-neutral name, which was a big thing. It was scary. You felt like you're losing a lot of momentum. And when I was reading articles, a lot of people said in the end they didn't regret it. Once you start going and it's about a year that you lose where they say your voice is settling, and after about a year your voice settles and you can kind of get back into singing. What actually happens from female to male transitions is so during puberty your larynx as a male extends and allows you to have a lower, longer vocal cords. So if you think of a guitar, the thinnest one is the highest pitch and the lowest is the thickest. So when you're transitioning and you're taking testosterone, what is happening is you're actually thickening your vocal cords. But once your larynx hardens, it actually can't get any bigger. So you lose a significant amount of your range. But what you can do to eliminate how much range you lose is taking a lower dose of testosterone over a longer period of time, which gives your voice lots of time to adjust. Working with a speech pathologist or a vocal coach who is familiar with transitioning and transgender voices. Finding ways to work with your new voice. And obviously you're not going to be able to sing the same songs the same way. And I think that is one of the hardest things that so far of what I've read and people I've spoken to have a difficult time with, because it can be quite frustrating. It's like learning to sing all over again. You're like, I was so good at this, why can't I do this now? Mm-hmm. But it is possible, and I just actually, on my way here, I found a video on YouTube, and it was the first transgender male on the X Factor. And it gave me kind of like this glimmer of hope, like, okay, it's not hopeless, it can happen, I just need to be patient. It is difficult to find help and people that are trained to help, because transgender, like, as we can tell, there's so much room to grow, and there's a lot of interest, and people are catching on now. But yeah, it's important to just make sure that you take care of your voice and your body, nutrition, like exercise, that all has a part to do of how you're going to perform, and just being patient with yourself is the main thing. So do your research, take it slow, don't be in a rush. My grandfather gave me a word of advice, and he said, it's not a race, and that's the truth. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Charlie. Daniel?
Hello, my name is Daniel Bork. I've been a student here for about 5 years, should have been 4. I'm going to discuss a little bit about my transition at the Mount, though I didn't take advantage of the health services. It's a bit more socially what I'm going to talk about. I also want to bring up on how to treat conversations with transgender individuals, because I find that lack of education is probably the biggest issue. And with lack of education comes anger and stress, and then it just keeps going in circles. So what I wanted to talk about was the particular needs for trans people as well. So the health services here could take into account binding, the effects of hormones, or people who are post-op, who are recovering. I also found, I've been working here at Mount Saint Vincent as well, and I found that there's not as much acceptance for preferred names. And so with student IDs, it feels like it would be unnecessary to keep legal names, because I see a lot of people who end up writing their unpreferred name on timesheets where I work. And so I find that there could be a little bit more wiggle room with that. I also wanted to talk about some stories about what happened here as well. And so when someone had misgendered me, meaning they called me by the wrong gender, and dead named me, called me by my previous name, when I confronted her, she was not sure how to respond, and therefore it was just kind of hostile. And so I find that with education, it would be a lot easier to know how to react to that, because the steps that I have found is it doesn't need to be as complicated as people think it is. So the way that I saw it was that when the misgendering happens, the first thing you need to just do is own up to it. Because people say, no, I didn't. No, you did. We listen. You did. And so all you need to do is apologize and move on. That's all you need to do. I've worked in fields where it's predominantly cis women who work there. And so I have customers who used to say, oh, I'm not wearing my glasses. Oh, you have long hair. And it's just kind of like, no, don't do that. I also wanted to talk about the appropriate things that are, the things that are appropriate to ask for transgender individuals, because there's a lot of topics that are no-nos. And so I find that people also are uneducated in that. So I find that we do need to have more education for those topics too. The Mount Get Real was a small program that I had for a couple months before we lost funding, but I find that it would be very useful, something similar to help with the faculty and even students to understand their colleagues or their students. Obviously, the preferred names and pronouns are important. That's why we put them all on the sheets in front of us. And I find that some people do get offended when you ask the preferred pronoun, but in most cases I've received relatively positive feedback, because it's much, as opposed to the saying it's better to ask forgiveness than permission, I find it's the opposite for that. It's better to ask permission than to ask for forgiveness in this case, because when you get misgendered, it's very heartening, like it's sickening. So it's just kind of, it's a lot better if someone pulled me aside and said, do you prefer male pronouns? I would go, yes, absolutely. And they go, okay, move on. And so I find that, yeah, education is the biggest need right now, especially in schools as well. I believe that was all I had for today. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel.
Hi, my name is Laura. I always, increasingly, it's funny, from the time I came out, I've been asked to serve on panels like this. When I first came out 6-7 years ago, I was one of the few people who would self-identify as trans. And so I was an easy go-to person. The interesting thing is, over time, I have less and less legitimacy at a table like this, because there aren't going to be people like me in the future. People aren't going to spend a half a century in the closet. They're going to come out when they're young, because they're going to come out in a world that understands what they are and has made room to accommodate them. I've been all of the identities over time, and it's interesting. By all of the identities, I mean I've identified myself as a pervert, as a transvestite, as a crossdresser, as a trans person, and so much of my life, my self-awareness was medicalized, was essentially determined by the medical authorities. I've lived through, I don't know how many different standards of care since Harry Benjamin, who was a doctor who pioneered gender reassignment surgeries, developed the standards of care. There's now an international organization, the World Professional Association of Transgender Health, which is now on its version 7 of the standards of care. But I remember a time when, access to hormones was restricted until you had lived full-time 2 years in your chosen gender in what was called a real-life trial. Well, what were they trying? The medical establishment was determining, do you pass as cisgender? If you do, we'll give you hormones. If you don't, we won't. So much has changed. And I'm increasingly aware that the experiences of mine are less relevant to younger people or less relevant to the experiences of those who will come after. And so I can remember a time, for example, where I thought, oh, gee, I'm going out for lunch. I better remember to have a salad and not meat, right? Because I thought those kinds of indicators helped smooth my gender transition and my gender perspective. I guess my own perspective has changed now, too. I don't necessarily describe myself as a woman. I always describe myself as trans. For much of my life, it wasn't possible to be trans. You had to be one or another. You had to fit into a binary. So there's a lot about nutrition that's really interesting. I mean, most of my generation of trans women experimented with things like herbal menopausal supplements, and messed ourselves up sometimes with those. Despite that, and despite the changing circumstances and the growing awareness, we continue to be a marginalized population, and I think older trans women in particular, because many of us have given up much of what we accomplished through most of our lives in order to transition. So in my case, I've worked professionally in government and public service communications. Guess what? They don't hire me to be your mouthpiece anymore. So I find myself living on, a fifth of what I used to make. I find myself relying on food banks. People don't donate fresh vegetables to food banks. They donate canned goods. You go to the grocery store and you're paying with supply management 3 times the market price for a lot of your supply managed commodities, so you don't have the variety in diet. You choose one thing and okay, that's breakfast for the week, and it's the same thing. You tend to eat what will last and what you can make multiple meals out of. The other element of it is that food is a social thing. It's one of those rituals that we've engaged in that build community and form relationships. And our exclusion includes, I have one-on-one friendships, but even though they may form a circle of friends, I'm not part of their circle. So I'm not included in what are important socializing experiences for me as well. The kinds of dinner parties, the kinds of opportunities where you get both exposure to a range of foods and a social network in which to eat. I raised a family. I was used to having lots of people around to eat with. And the lack of that impacts my motivation to do it. I really am quite borderline anorexic. And it's not for the conventional reasons of body image. It's more economic. I associate eating with the consuming of resources. So when my resources are scarce, the best thing I can do to save is not eat. And deconstructing that thinking and applying it to our community, like it's, a complex thing. So I see food fundamentally from the lens of poverty and marginalization. So to talk about optimum nutrition seems a luxury. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Ray?
Hi, my name is Ray. I'm an IT worker, a trans woman, of course, an opinionated tweeter, and I'm here as the secretary of the NS Rainbow Action Project. And as someone who's kind of recently, relatively speaking, started transitioning, I started a couple of years ago. I wanted to kind of speak about my experiences in it and the difficulties in medical access for trans people, specifically in this province, but it kind of applies universally. Trans people in general have a very high hill to climb in accessing proper health care. We have the usual difficulties that anyone in this province does because we currently have a healthcare crisis. But we have additional challenges that are rooted in tradition, habits, misinformation, discrimination, and that's on top of existing race, gender, or neurodivergence discrimination that anyone else faces as well. I decided to transition at age 34, and I sought the assistance of a private therapist because access to a public one, I was told, for someone in my age bracket was going to be at least a year and a half. And I don't think I could have lasted a year and a half, because when someone decides to transition, they're usually at among the most vulnerable times of their life, because they have effectively decided to hit the reset button and do things right. I thankfully had sufficient income to afford a private therapist, and which is a good thing, because we don't have an informed consent model in this province, which means if you want to access hormone care, you need a therapist to refer you. So a therapist has to listen to you and then has to write a note that says, yes, they are the gender they identify as, because we don't trust people, we trust doctors. So that was the first challenge. Now, I am one of the other one, or another one is, I'm one of the few people blessed to have a GP in this province, which is also very difficult to get. Very difficult. However, even with the therapist referral in hand, my GP was not comfortable pursuing hormone replacement therapy. It is not a complex process. I'd venture it's simple enough even for a layperson to do, which unfortunately some have been forced to do. But you just don't get the safety of blood screenings and regular monitored care. It doesn't involve any complication, unless there's a complication with the patient's health status. Most GPs are already equipped to provide this kind of care for example, postmenopausal women, men with androgen deficiencies, such as that. My GP refused to pursue any of this, nor consult with any of the internationally recognized WPATH standards of care available to them or anyone who has a printer. Rather, they referred me to an endocrinologist, a public endocrinologist, which at the time had, again, a 1.5-year waiting list. And that refusal brought me closer to the brink than anything in recent memory. Thankfully, a friend had referred me to a wonderful institution that's on Quinpool called the Halifax Sexual Health Center. It had a 5-month waiting list, but that was better and manageable, and they've been taking really good care of me ever since. But it's silly that I have a GP, but I also have a GP at a nonprofit clinic to provide me with my hormone care when one should be able to do both. Because for some professionals, we're an unknown or scary. Some people have even told me how difficult it is they have in finding a gynecologist even willing to look at a neovagina, which for the most part, the skills are transferable. We're not asking to do something wildly out of there. But they've never been told that it's the same. They've never been trained, or they just don't want to look into it, similar to my GP. We need medical professionals to accept us as they would any other patient. We're not that different from any other person that they might come across, but we're treated with a suspicion or as a liability or a complicating factor or, a blip. There's no reason we shouldn't mandate the training and care for trans people and our frontline medical staff. There's no reason why my GP shouldn't be told, you must treat trans women. Here's the quick 1 hour of paperwork you have to read to learn how to do it. Because I looked up at the standards of care. It was a nighttime reading on my bed. It's easy. There's nothing particularly complicated about them. And lastly, not everyone requires or can pursue physical or medical treatment to alleviate their dysphoria, but those that do and can, it can be life-altering in a way modern medicine has nothing else to compare with. It's the best antidepressant one could get. The medical system still limits what treatment we provide, though. For example, we are in this province fortunate enough that genital reconstruction is covered. In trans men, chest reconstruction is covered. Not in trans women, because I guess in trans women it's considered vanity. Even though testosterone puberty can render most breast development in what a traditionally male frame difficult to notice. But we don't get that benefit. We don't cover hair removal, which is needed in pretty much in many cases. So including if it's a covered surgery, you might need hair removal for the surgery area, and that's not covered. The surgery is, but the hair removal to get ready for the surgery that's covered isn't. There's gaps, basically, is what I'm getting at. And I've only really just scratched the surface of it. But really, we just need the medical system in this province and elsewhere to recognize our plight as important and urgent as any cisgender patients. That alone would go a long way, as would an informed consent model, which would at least remove the therapy barrier, basically, that we also have, even though we also need better access to therapy and mental health care in this province. So, yeah.
Great, thank you, Ray. And Maxine?
Hi, my name is Maxine Brewer. I'm a registered nurse and manager of MSVU Health Services up in Assisi. Coming last was actually quite fascinating because it does make me realise more and more that unfortunately our healthcare system is in quite disarray at the minute. And I would like to state I'm not by any means an expert in this subject that I've been invited to attend today, but I would like to think of myself as an advocate and very privileged to be in this position. So really a little bit about my involvement at helping change the health services at the Mount was I've been really lucky to have a couple of patients that I've been involved in their journey from post-op care, where people have unfortunately had to leave the province but come back, and I'm able to follow them after things like top surgery. I would like to think as time goes along that we will be able to offer more and more, but as you rightly said, one of the big things is getting our GPs on board. And I think I guess for me, it's if I can get people to come see me, then you've almost broached half the way. I love talking with people, so that conversation, I have a lot more time to do that than maybe some of our GPs do. And then communicating people's needs onto the GP is then part of my job to help assist and advocate. All our patients need very different care from each other. My care to your care is very different. And it doesn't matter who we are. That's ultimately what we're aiming for, is just to make sure that you're receiving the care that you need. And the knowledge behind that. So it was quite fascinating when people started, when I started to approach people about what they would like us to provide. The first thing was looking at our patient profile form. So we soon realized that it's really simple. You tell me your name, that's your name. We don't have to worry about anything else. I'll just see your health card, and that's the other information that we need. So my name's Maxine. That's all we need to know. Further on, more than that, my next concern was making sure that, say, for example, your body has a cervix or your body has a prostate. Are you aware of what the health requirements are to look after those parts of your body? No different from your eyes. How often do you go to an ophthalmologist to go and get checked out? So just making sure each part of your body is being looked after uniquely for you, and making sure that you're doing it on time, getting it in a timely manner, and that you're able to come in and feel safe in that's in our space, in your space, to make sure that accessing the healthcare that you feel that you need at that time is super comfortable. We love talking about all our body parts. So, and then it made me realize, even down to the things that are on the walls in the health office. You know, there was breast screening was directly for women. If you're a woman, are you getting your breasts? Are you going for screening? We've changed all of that now. So little by little, I feel like we are making improvements. They're small improvements, but for me, in the bigger scheme of things, simple improvements for people to come in to get the care that they need. And I really hope that that continues, and I'm certainly willing to have anybody come and ask, speak with me. Actually, there's an Ask a Nurse app on the MSVU website. It's completely confidential. I'm the only person that gets those messages. So again, you don't even have to call the office. You can just email me directly through Ask a Nurse, or even directly, and then I'm very welcome to make a time for a conversation for what people need. But just quickly, because I know time's wrapping up, we're pretty lucky this year because we have a WPATH trained counsellor for students. I know it's just for students. And I'm also able to help with letters to support surgeries, to offer that they know that wherever they're people are having surgeries, that they can come back and they'll have post-op care. I'm also able to help with name changes, completing forms, and again, I'm really willing to look at everything. I do hormonal injections. Our doctors do prescribe. There is a little bit of a hitch there in the sense that some of them do prefer that the initial prescription comes from an endocrinologist. But again, the more comfortable I feel I get with any treatments that we can offer people, then hopefully we'll get the doctors on board too. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to the panel. I think everybody in the audience agrees. There's a lot of excellent information there and really informative. And thank you for sharing your stories. There's a vulnerability there, so we certainly appreciate you being here tonight and for supporting others within our community and giving advice around nutrition and health. So we still do have lots of food up there, but we are going to open up to a question and answer session with the audience. So we just ask if you have a question to take one of the microphones, because we are live streaming this so that we can access this information to others who might feel either more comfortable watching it at home or just can't make it tonight. So are there any questions that the audience has for one of our panel members? Yeah, for sure, absolutely.
I just want to offer a comment and observation, because I noticed these days, since I used to live in rural Nova Scotia for like 15 years, after living in this city and then returning to transition. We forget that university campuses are among the most diverse and cosmopolitan places in our province. And it's very easy to forget that out there, things are still very entrenched in a culture that is facing a lot of change that makes it uncertain. It's moving from what it was relatively a monoculture to a culture that's diverse. We're increasingly having difficult conversations about our colonial past, about our role as settlers, white people talking about being white. That's not new in that's very new in Nova Scotia. It's not new other places necessarily. And it's important everything occurs within that context. One of the things that occurs in Nova Scotia is you cannot consume a public service without getting judged. All of our institutions, whether it's municipal governments, school boards, educators, anybody in a position of social authority sees themselves and has been raised to see themselves as keepers of our values. And that has a huge impact if you don't meet the standard for acceptance within the monoculture. And so I think it's important to remember that everything occurs within that culture, and it's a challenging time for Nova Scotians because their culture is both being challenged and changed in ways that are unfamiliar and threatening. Thanks.
Thank you. Any questions for our panel?
Hi, thanks. This has been amazing and such good information. But so my question is for Daniel, and that I'm on faculty here at the university. So you had some items that you wanted to talk about, and I know you didn't get to talk about everything that you wanted to say. But just in terms of advice for faculty, and you talked a little bit about the no-nos and the pronoun issue. But is there other things that we should be aware of in our classrooms?
I find that it's not always obvious, and so my first day here, was taking a test, and someone called a feminine name, and someone who clearly presented masculine got up, and I actually got to know him later on, and I knew that that wasn't his preferred name, and so it was just kind of, I guess it's not, you should ask everybody, but I guess it's also people should speak up if needed. I know it's very difficult to do that. I know it was very difficult for me to start saying, because when I started transitioning while I was at work, and so I kind of said, can I change my name tag to something else? And so they were just kind of like, no. And so, okay. But, so it does have to be a lot of courage to admit that you are transgender. It's difficult to do that, especially the first time to people that you don't know very well. But yeah, I guess if there's suspicion, I shouldn't really use suspicion, but if there's something seems a little different, because people who'd see me in public would not assume that I'm female. But some people who hear my voice, who see that I'm only 5'4" or things like that, they might assume that I'm female, but they don't know, so it's best to ask. But yeah, I find that it needs to be communication on both ends, really. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Hi, thanks to everyone who gave a talk tonight. This is a wonderful panel, and it's a really a lovely, diverse range of topics. I was going to talk. I'm the AVP Research here, so I'm always interested in research, and I could ask you enough questions for the rest of the night, but I won't. I promise. One of the things that I do in my spare time is sing. In fact, I'm going to sing tonight. So I'm fascinated, Charlie, with your story. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the vocal coaching kind of thing. But the other thing I just wanted to say, generally speaking, is I've done a lot of different work in my life. And what I find exclusively is that equity-seeking groups have to do their own advocacy over and over and over again. So if you're lesbian, you don't come out once, you come out 50,000 times. Right? If you're trans, you have to keep explaining, and that has a cost. That has an emotional cost, it has a financial cost, as you pointed out, Laura, and it just has a physical cost in terms of kind of sheer exhaustion. So I just wanted to say that I totally acknowledge that pain and what it's like to live that space. And now I want to hear about the singing.
All right. Well, I actually only publicly came out as trans 3 months ago, January 1st or 2nd of this year. So, and it's been, I found over the years, like I've been singing before I could talk, and then they put me into music school and all those things. But singing's always just been a big part of my identity. And in a big way, it's been kind of like my mental health output, right? So, yeah, so definitely when coming to the conclusion of like, I'm definitely trans, now that I accept this, I definitely don't want to live in the dark, like I want to be true to myself and my gender identity. What is that going to mean for my singing career, right? Like that was a huge fear for me. As many transgender people, anyone that sings, anyone that has this identity within themselves, like they're afraid to lose it, obviously. So, and over the years, I always found some reason that was good enough for me, that was just like kind of put like oh well, yeah, I'm just a lesbian. That's why I'm like this. Or a friend of mine, which lasted the last 3 years, I guess, was, don't confuse sexuality with gender. And that was like, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. And so it was just always these reasons where that I just didn't want to accept that I was transgender because of all of the things that are going to come with it. And it's quite difficult. So, so when, it was late December when I was finally like, okay, I think I'm going to make the call. I'm going to do this. And for me, that was more than just coming out and being like, my name is Charlie now, these are my pronouns, trying to get acceptance from friends and family. It was quite literally like a business change, right? So I had to change my website, so I had to buy a new domain name. I had to quite literally put a deadline on music projects that I had, like you can't transition halfway through an album, or you can't go on a tour, all these things that all of a sudden I had to think about that were never in my mind before. And so with that, obviously came a lot of research. And, like I said, I kind of gave you the brief of everything. And to a certain point, I found a couple of people, who YouTube videos, articles, stuff like that, who decided not to transition because they already were so involved in their music career. And they were like, well, I already have a following, I'm comfortable enough with myself, it's fine, I'm not going to do it. And, there's definitely days where I think about that, and I'm just like, you're singing a song, you sing it so well, you love it, and then you're like, do I want to risk losing this ability? And then I realize it's not losing the ability, and the more research I do, the more videos I watch of other people singing, after transitioning, you kind of gain that confidence, right? And you're like, no, you know what, they're doing it, I can do it. And so pretty much, working with, your question there, to get back to the point, is working with coaches. And so I have a good friend of mine that I went to elementary school right up through high school with, and she is now a speech pathologist with an specific interest of transgenders and their voice. And so she's been a great resource for telling me, don't do this, make sure you do this. If you're gonna do this, make sure you don't do this, So looking out for me, and also I was like, okay, sweet, so I need to find a coach. I was like, can you help me find a coach? And she's like, there's actually only one in Halifax, all of HRM, who is trained to vocal coach someone transitioning from female to male. And she's like, probably a long waiting list for you. And I was like, well, I'll just find a regular vocal coach. And she's like, well, you have to be very careful with that, because when regular vocal coaches aren't actually trained to work with the kind of transition that your voice is doing. And you have to be it's very delicate. You're quite literally molding your voice, right? And that's why when I mentioned taking lower levels of testosterone to kind of give yourself that time to really stretch. It's almost like, I'm going to use the guitar thing again. Just like when you put new strings on your guitar, you kind of stretch them out. You give it a couple of days. They're going to go out of tune. You put it back in tune. But eventually it settles, right? And that's exactly what you're doing with your voice. So it's super important to go out. And if you can't find a vocal coach in person, then research. And there's lots of it out there. I know almost everyone who is transitioning wants to have an impact on other people who are brave enough to come out and be like, I'm doing it. It's like, sweet, awesome, let me help you. And one way that I'll wrap up with this is, as mentioned, I run a mental health awareness campaign, and it's #SOSNS. And what a part of that, in order to spread those other people's stories, is through a podcast. And so I want to be doing podcasts and YouTube videos, and that's one of the topics I want to cover, because I think that there's not enough people out there being affirming it. It's like, you can do it, I'm going to do it, we're going to do it together, find your voice again. Thank you for the question.
Great, thank you, Charlie.
If I could just add to that from a trans woman's perspective, There's a woman who recently retired from Nova Scotia Hearing and Speech Clinic who for 25 years in this community has done vocal training with trans women. Who knew? I know Charlie used the word only. There's only one practitioner in Halifax. It's astounding there's any at all.
Yeah.
And not to keep things in the binary, obviously one of the things that our awareness of non-binary people has done is eliminated a lot of boundaries. For them, it's still very scary because they don't have role models who are a generation older than them to help shape their own vision of themselves over time, whereas those of us who are binary identified too. There's a saying among trans women, trans guys always pass. Keep in mind, the default form for human is female. All human fetuses are conceived in female form. It's the default form. You add to it with testosterone in time, the eyebrow bossing, the squaring of the jaw, the enlargement of the larynx. So for someone who does not go through puberty to acquire those characteristics, acquires some of those secondary characteristics later in life, they do so seamlessly. For trans women, it's about taking away, not adding to. It's very hard to do. So too with voice, because in puberty we grow this little chamber at the like if you're a cis male and you put your fingers over both sides of your larynx, you can feel it vibrate on both sides. Most cis women, it only vibrates in the top. So what you have to learn to do is not use the bottom part of your voice, not resonate from your chest, resonate from your face. It's not much of a pitch change, though they do teach it. But most of the trans women I know now don't use that voice. I use it when I sing, for example. But our voices are among the most personal markers of ourselves that we have. I've lived over 50 years with this voice. To try and change it now sounds false to me. And so much of the accusation of trans women is one of falsehood, one of like, you know. So those things that remind us ourselves of the ways in which we're deliberately adopting characteristics can be really dysphoric. One of the reasons I identify openly as trans is because I'm not going to use the voice. It sounds false to me, and my voice is a dead giveaway. And in this culture where, for some reason, Nova Scotians can't just gender you once, they've got to do it a half a dozen times in a transaction. Yes, sir, thank you, sir, yes, buddy, yes, man. Cut it the fuck out. Who the hell are you to guess what gender somebody is? And then tell me you're showing me respect? Bullshit. Cut it out. But we do that. Anyway, point being, it's a different process, but there is expertise. And for some, I know trans women who you would not tell by their voice that they weren't a cis woman. Thanks.
If I can add just a little bit to that as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I've never performatively danced. I'm what you would call a drunk sing. I'm what you call a drunk singer, like shower in pubs, basically. I am the sibling of a musician, but never transferred entirely. I have gotten to know some musicians who are trans women. So yeah, like what Laura mentioned, that change we go through in testosterone puberty is a one-directional change. So we have to kind of mimic, in a sense, what the voice would have sounded like had we not gone through that change, for the reason that it is such a big identifier. Over the phone, for example, we can do anything we want in terms of our presentation, but if you call someone over the phone, you have to deal with inflection. You have to deal with tone, pitch, resonance, all these other things. And yeah, there is the one provider in Halifax, which is a miracle in its own right, and he's very kind to the one who's taken up the mantle as well, but overwhelmed. There's a lot to do. But one thing too is, and I feel like this applies to people from, either end of the binary and anywhere in between, is that when you sing, you're effectively trading a voice that you had with a voice that you either want or you feel more comfortable in or you can hide behind. And, all these, it's always a compromise. And so oftentimes a trans woman might go through, their day with a voice, and then they'll start singing in a voice that is closer to what their old voice, pre-training voice was, because that's how you project. The one thing about a testosterone-induced voice is that it's very booming and goes very far. And so that's usually an asset when you're singing, and especially if you're used to singing a certain way, you've probably designed your music around that voice, the pitches you could reach, all these other things, and you either decide to sacrifice that, or you don't, or you compromise on it, and that in itself can also have a psychological impact, because even though it'd be me singing in the shower or drunk in a pub, if I decide to, my claim to fame in a pub was I could sing Mary Mac at speed. But if I want to sing, or anyone wants to sing, I get this feeling of, oh, now I'm showing myself as male, right? Which is unfair. A lot of that is societal expectation, but it's also I never felt like that voice was mine, but it was, and it was the one I kind of mastered. And here I am doing my very best to kind of get away with at least a voice that doesn't sound terrible. And I'm about a year and a half in trying to train my voice. The waiting list for the speech pathology is still a little too long for me to get there. I've had some help. I've done some progress. But yeah, it is a challenge when it comes to, that is a challenge of transition that is I wouldn't say overlooked. A lot of people tend to recognize that, a trans woman will have a voice, or will have a certain voice or inflection. Some of them can hide it very well, but it's definitely an element of transition that can prove very challenging. And it's not entirely for presentation purposes, it's not entirely for stealth purposes. Sometimes it's like anything else, it's because I don't feel like I should have a voice that sounded as gravelly and low and male as my old one did. I feel it doesn't fit the face anymore. So yeah, it's an interesting challenge, and involves some compromise, and it's weird, I guess.
Great, thanks very much, Ray. Christine? You just need the mic. That's the only rule.
Okay, this is such an education, got to say. So as I mentioned before, I'm on faculty, but what I teach is early childhood education. And so I'm going to direct this to anybody who would like to speak to it. There's two things. One is that I've talked with the students who are trans, but they're nervous about their practicum placements because it's going to be with young children. And so trying to explain, are you a boy, are you a girl type of thing. So any words of wisdom for that. And also, if you could go back, thinking about your own childhood, advice that you would give somebody who is, an early childhood educator or a teacher in schools would be welcomed as well, too.
I'm just gonna jump in right quick, because recently I had an experience with a good friend of mine and his partner, and their 4-year-old, I believe. And so they kind of gave the 4-year-old a brief before I got there, like Charlie is a boy, and he's a he, And as they got a little more comfortable with me throughout the evening, I kind of overheard. Her name is Ryan, and she was like, I thought, is Charlie a boy? And her mom was like, yes, Charlie's a boy. And she was so she was so accepting of that. And I think that, even my little brother, he's 16, but my experience with it so far is kids, as long as you educate them, and and they don't, they're never like, oh, well, that person's black and that person's white. They don't think that way, right? And most of the time. And so as long as they're educated by either their parents or they're told, hey, it's okay. Yeah, this person is a boy, or this person is a girl. This is how they identify. Most of the time, I've seen children react very well to it. So, in my own experience.
So a couple of notes on that, just from my own experiences, through Relate experiences and such. So if there's any piece of advice I can give to any parents out there, educate your kids about it. It's very important. When I was freshly out, right, like especially I was far more apparent and very self-conscious about myself. I'm still a little self-conscious, but who isn't? A little child comes in, adorable little child, and I'm waiting at the pharmacy. I'm like in the little waiting nook next to the counter, and the little kid comes by and says, "Are you a boy or a girl?" And their parents are just off in the distance. I'm not sure if they're even noticing or whatever else. But here I am looking at this child, and I have to explain to this child that I'm a girl. But there's that fear, because am I imposing on the parents? Are the parents transphobic? Are the parents thinking I'm indoctrinating their children? There's that element of kind of a danger, of a risk that you feel like, because you don't know. Kids are crazy accepting. You tell one of my childhood friends' children, I'm basically their honorary aunt, I guess. For a long time, I was their honorary uncle. And when I came out, the kid, like, basically my friend sat him down and said, like, if you remember this person, turns out, they're actually a girl, but they've been hiding it for a long time, and now they're going to start living as a girl as they always were. And like she goes through this really lovely little, like, simplified, nice explanation of it. And her kid looks at her and says, "So she's an aunt now?" Like, that's it. That was it. There was no having to re-educate or anything. At this point, I'm Auntie Ray. That's it. And so the kid is fine, but because the adults might not be, and because we don't know this, it's always this fear, because the kid will come in and will ask. And I have to be honest, like, "Are you a boy or girl?" "Well, I'm a girl just like you," or whatever, like, What will the parents think? What will the parents, will they walk over? Will they throw something at me? Will they pull the kid behind? It's hard to know. Or maybe the parent's going to be happy that I educated their kid about it, but it shouldn't be my job. It shouldn't be any of our jobs. This is a thing they're going to run into at school. This is a thing they're going to run into on the street. It's going to everywhere. Really make sure your kids are aware of it so that that awkward moment doesn't happen.
If there's something I hope is changing in Nova Scotia, I should say I'm the parent of two children who are now 26 and 24. And they were the first generation to grow up in Nova Scotia with access to the internet. And as I say, they were the first generation in Nova Scotia for whom the rest of the community could not hide the rest of the world, because we made an effort to do so for years and years. You don't need to know about that, dear. That doesn't happen here. I worked for the South Shore School Board at a time about 10, 15 years ago when a new sexual health resource was introduced at the middle school. Now, you have to understand, parents in Lunenburg County didn't get any sex education. Grandparents in Lunenburg County didn't get any sex education. They got a lot of sanctioning of it through society and religion, but education about it? So you got to know that book was read. And 5 years out, I said one of the consequences of that book was that people in adults in Lunenburg County can now openly talk about people being gay. Up until then, they could only openly make fun of us. They didn't have permission to accept. The saving grace of Nova Scotians is that I think we're thin on hatred, but we are glacially thick with ignorance and with commitment to one way of seeing the world. And the best thing we can do for ourselves and our children is have a roving viewpoint, learn to see it around. My own views of gender have changed, but invariably, I get the best reaction from kids. I was at a conference in Providence last year. 3 or 4 12-year-old kids come by. I had an ankle injury at the time. They asked me about my ankle injury and then noticed my voice. So then they said, "Well, are you a boy or a girl?" And I said, "I'm a trans woman." They go, "Oh, no wonder you look like both." Walk away. Like, now to me, that's a cool outcome, right? that, it's the parents that go, oh, don't ask that. That says there's something wrong with us, right? And so let your own, sit with your own discomfort, but don't pass it on to your kids.
If I can actually add to that, it's not, this is almost an answer to a question that wasn't asked, but it was a good takeoff from when you mentioned sex education. If there's one thing I've noticed in the last couple of years is, and I suspect everyone who's transitioned has run across this, when you are a child, you typically go through sex education. And they tell you how all the bits work and how all the things work and what everything you should do, what to expect through your puberty, right? Puberty 1.0 has an education. Puberty 2.0 does not. So you're an adult and you're starting to transition and you don't know how your body's going to work as well. You don't know what things to expect. What are you going to expect for voices? I didn't know, for example, there are certain things I was told adamantly wouldn't happen that did. I didn't realize your shoe size drops. The general rule of thumb is, well, it's a skeleton bit. Skeleton bits are hardened. They don't change. I went down 2 shoe sizes. I bought a load of shoes and they didn't fit anymore. So it's just weird little both physical and societal things. Even something as simple as how to practice safe sex after, general reconstruction surgery. We don't have a sex ed. And so we go through the lovely experience of awkward teen years as an adult without the excuse of being awkward teenagers. And so I just thought that was an interesting thing. I probably should have even brought up in the speech is, we generally go through our own sex ed 2.0 on our own or via the internet, and we all know how great the internet is as an information resource. So just figured I'd bring that up. Sorry.
Great, thank you.
When I first transitioned, sorry not to preclude the next question, when I first transitioned, I noticed I do have a family doctor, but I go to the doctor at mid-morning when it's full of moms and little kids, and the moms would be like, don't be sitting next to that, that's a pervert, right? And it was only when I said to my doctor, why don't you get a little diversity in your signage? How come I only see white people on your wall? How come I only see people who are identifiably male or female and I'm supposed to guess and I'm supposed to know and I'm supposed to reinforce that notion that I'm the arbiter of your gender, which is how we behave. So it's all sorts of, it's the environment around us and what that creates to legitimize diversity that takes a lot of pressure off of us to explain ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely.
I totally agree with the signage. Again, that was something that we worked quite hard on for the health office, and I've been really interested in seeing the response that has brought. I have a poster for advertising for people to have PAPs, and again, it's not for one specific gender or the other. And I love how people stand there and they're just really thinking about it. And it's great to get that conversation going and to get people really thinking. And you're absolutely right. We totally have to rethink our environment. We really do.
Great, thank you. Maybe we have time for 1 or 2 questions, and then we're going to give an opportunity for people just to mingle and have some conversation around food. So, Jonathan? Yes, you need a mic.
All right. Thank you for being here. Each of your narratives in your particular context has been enlightening and educational. I'm also on faculty here, new here from the United States. So my question's going to be about also Bray with recommendations, but also the high school years. Since I work in the United States with Twin Spirit youth in high school, and we all know high school can be a real bitch. And it's really trying to figure out everything. But what I'm experiencing with particularly the United States is now that it's been going forward, but now with the current administration, it's going backwards now. particularly in the United States, where now there's certain communities who do not agree, who do not want to be educated, who are now emboldened. Now, within the Two-Spirit community and the natives in where I'm from, there's a community there which is safe. But outside that community, it's open game almost. And so I'm always trying to find out what recommendations would you give to these students right now, where there's now a lot more open hostility and emboldenedness within community, with outside communities, with trying to come out, trying to transgender themselves. Like I said, in our community, in a community, it's no problem. It's part of the community, and that's just the way it is. But outside, when you leave that Indian center, like open game. So what recommendation you do with these high school students who are going through a very confusing time, and they want to be safe?
I wish that was an easy answer. I grew up in the United States, so I'm well familiar with the puritanical streak that runs through the American psyche. I also lived through, the J. Edgar Hoovers and Henry Anslingers and McCarthy and Cohn and Nixon, many of whom were men who were themselves homosexuals who spent their lives persecuting men who were just like them. There's really no place in Halifax I don't go at any hour of the day or night. That's one of the ways in which I preserve the socialization I had as a man. I presume I have the privilege to go anywhere. It's a safe city and it allows me to do that. That's not the case everywhere. And so I don't, without being in that circumstance, it's difficult to even think that I could offer any real advice other than I've seen so much change in the course of my life. I lived so much of my life not believing that it's possible to live as I do now. And all I can remember is that, meme line that's attributed to Gandhi. First they ignore us, then they laugh at us, then they fight us, then we win.
A lot of my noisy twittering, and of course some of the work with like NSRAP and such, the fact of the matter is, most of that answer, unfortunately, isn't up to the youth. It's like the youth can definitely take some steps, make sure, anything I suggest is going to sound dirty because the idea is it puts the onus on the wrong person. But you could say just make good friends, the standard ways of if you think you're going into a bullying environment to kind of be careful with it. But really, the things to remember, power emboldens, platforms embolden. If you want to weaken the people who would hurt those who venture out of those safer communities, is to make sure that the ones who exposit, who encourage hate, who encourage these hateful behaviors, this divisiveness, you deplatform them, depower them if you can. It actually we can sit here and say, well, in the US, the administration wants to, let's be honest, wants to extinguish or kill trans people. That's effectively, practically their stated goal at this point, and that's terrifying. But here we are in Canada with one political party outright saying the same thing, and another political party, the official opposition, more or less dancing around the same thing. And we constantly live in this fear of a pendulum swing too, right? Right now, the elections this year, if there's a large victory for a party that has shown nothing but contempt for gender identity, they might take that, again, as an approval of the platform against gender identity, B, as a winning strategy to continue winning elections, and C, as I mentioned before, it's going to embolden the worst of us because they're going to see that, yeah, the ones who do have these views, who do have these strategies, are the ones who get successful and powerful. And so I guess whenever, call someone out if you see someone being hateful, and it's safe. Don't put yourself in danger, obviously, but call someone out if you notice someone's being hateful, if someone's making a really bad joke or a really stupid thing. Call them out if you can, or at least try to educate them. Again, there's no really good solution or answer to it, especially when it comes to, I mean, again, I speak from this as a white person too. I have at least the privilege of I have the white privilege that's afforded to me. Things are even obviously a lot rougher for, you know, Two-Spirit Indigenous people as well, or trans people of color, which has a whole other slew. And we should also make sure to deplatform those who preach hatred against that. You know, so yeah, there's no one-size-fits-all. Best way I could suggest is the same things they're probably already kind of doing for their own safety anyway. Try to get a good friend who can stand by you. Avoid overly hostile places if they know they're overtly hostile and they have a choice in the matter. And for everyone else, just make sure to call out and look out for someone in that vulnerable position if you can.
Yeah, it's very challenging for them to go to the bathroom. You guys set the policy, you go to the bathroom.
Yeah.
But then they're afraid to go back to the bathroom now because you have heads of state, United States said, well, one's all for conversion therapy.
Yeah.
And one other one's about military, get rid of all that. So they're kind of taking two steps back.
Absolutely, because we're an easy target. We're generally the easiest target when it comes to fascistic ideology. I mean, at the risk of pulling a Godwin, the Nazis went after trans and queer people among the first. And they used that as part of one of the reasons why there was this global Jewish conspiracy to feminize people and all these other things. And they famously burnt, there was an institute, a world famous institute for sexuality and gender in Germany. I'm not even going to try to say the name in German. But basically they grabbed all the documentation from there because people were registered. Germany, pre-Nazi Germany, was actually progressive in that regard. They grabbed all the documentation, used that to round up all trans queer people around, sent them to the camps, grabbed the doctors, sent them to the camps, burnt the institution down and all the paperwork. We've lost decades of research. We're still catching up. And then, again, used that as just another justification for their war on the Jewish people by saying, look, most of these doctors are Jewish, therefore it's a conspiracy to try to demasculinize our men and so forth and so on. So.
As a result of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada, I think a lot of white people are starting to look at decolonization and look at starting to understand the ways in which we're the beneficiaries and complicit in a genocide. And one of the things that comes out of that is the notion of intersectionality, that we can no longer be on a single dimension. Of that, you know, I can't oppose transphobia and tell ethnic jokes and expect that to be, you know, a legitimate viewpoint. So it's about challenging our casual racisms, challenging the privileges that we take for granted, having those hard conversations with ourselves. But we also live in a political climate where, particularly what I notice among younger activists is there's a desire to penalize rather than to heal and to cure. And we need to give each other the permission to make mistakes with the commitment to get it right. But, you know, I think we all have to start having much harder conversations.
Great, thank you. I think that's a great place to end. We're going to invite you now to please mingle, have some food, speak to our panel, and if we could just do one more round of thank you and appreciation to our panel. Fantastic.